So what happened in the Arboretum on March 21st, 1966?
The scream echoed down the hall of the second-floor east wing of McIntyre dorm.
At least that's what Gidget Cone wrote in the Collegian all those years ago.
At least 62 girls saw something that night, but they can't even explain what they saw.
Even with all of our research, it's been really difficult to pin down exactly what happened that night.
There were so many testimonies about what happened in Hillsdale that night, but half of the witnesses still living refused to talk to us.
Not to mention the involvement of a future U.S. president.
All I'm saying is that when you look at the facts, it seems quite possible that there were aliens in the Arb.
On June 24th, 1947, Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot, witnessed something unforgettable along his journey through the Yakima River Valley. Looking out into the night sky, he claimed to have seen 9 shiny bright objects traveling near Mount Rainier. He calculated them to be moving at up to 1,200 miles per hour. The sighting of what appeared to be something entirely otherworldly erupted in a national fascination of space, aliens, and specifically, unidentified flying objects. Some believed that the objects he saw were extraterrestrial, others that the flying saucers were some military experiment, and even some accused Arnold of insanity. In the weeks following Arnold's sighting, hundreds of people across the country claimed to have similar sightings. Flight 105, the infamous Roswell incident, and numerous other accounts led to the rapid development of conspiracy theories and speculations across the nation. Concerns arose about the Soviet Union's possible involvement in the matter. As reports flooded in, the U.S. Air Force decided to investigate the UFO sightings further. In 1952, Project Blue Book was launched. Its mission was twofold: to evaluate the threat of UFO sightings to national security, and to study the scientific implications of the UFO's existence. Made up of a team of both Air Force personnel and scientists, Project Blue Book compiled thousands of UFO reports. However, their conclusions were ambiguous and elusive, suggesting around 90% of the sightings could be explained by astronomical or man-made phenomenon. The UFO hysteria continued through the 50s as the Cold War kept heating up. Nobody was spared from the UFO fascination, as talk of space and the extraterrestrial had continued presence in the media, books, movies, and TV shows of the time. By the 60s, nearly every state had reported some sort of incident involving UFOs, even an alleged abduction in New Hampshire. The frenzy surrounding UFO sightings in the United States came to a head on March 20th, when a UFO was spotted in Dexter, Michigan, just 60 miles from Hillsdale.
The saucer mystery of 1966 began here, near Dexter, Michigan, late in March. And before the month was out, flying saucers were being reported from New Jersey to California, from Colorado to Long Island, from Ohio to Georgia.
On the 20th of March in Dexter, about 8:30 in the evening, Frank Manor, his son Ronald, his wife, and his family had 10 kids. They were having a dinner. It was like after the dinner hours, big family reunion. And Frank went out because the dogs were howling. He goes, they never howl. So he goes out there and he sees this light, these flashing lights, a singular blob coming down and landing a few hundred yards from the farmhouse that they were living in.
Well, first beginning, we were watching television, and we have 6 dogs here, and they started raising a fuss, in which they never do much. So I went outside and gave a yell at them, and as I turned around to come back on the porch, I looked to the north of me, and looked like a fallen star meteor. It was red and kind of coming down and on about a 45, and so then I watched it, and I was going to see if it landed and then maybe go down and see what it was. And when it got to the top of the trees, it stopped, and a blue and a white light come on it. And I looked at it, and I thought I was seeing things.
And then the hysteria hit Hillsdale.
Hillsdale co-ed spot flying saucer. Eyewitness account by Gidget Cohn. UFO! The scream echoed down the hall of the second floor east wing of the new women's dorm. It was 10:30, Monday night, March 21st. I ran to my window, and there it was, radiating intense silver-white light and heading directly for the dorm. A brief flash of lightning illuminated it for just a second, and in that moment I saw what appeared to be a squashed football or basketball. The object nervously darted east, away from us, stopped in midair again, and moved in a jerky lateral way, first north, then south, then up and down. It seemed to be frantic.
On the evening of March 21st, 1966, the women of McIntyre Dormitory spotted something moving towards them over the treetops of the Arboretum. The first shouts identified the mysterious lights as a UFO, and girls flocked to their windows to catch a glimpse of something they could hardly believe.
No, it moved very rapidly at any speed, or rather any direction it wanted to go. Why it could change and go to the right or the left or go crossways without hesitating a bit.
What do you think it was?
Well, if they call it a flying saucer, that's what it is.
Basically, the Hillsdale Arboretum, a strange light came into focus and was eventually spotted by several students in the women's dormitory right by there, who sort of crowded around windows to see what was going on, and eventually got the attention of several of the dorm mothers in there, and eventually also the civil defense director, Mr. Van Horn, who just watched the thing. No one was permitted to go out and actually touch it or get close to it except for a local police officer, Harold Hess, with his partner Jerry Wise, drove up to pretty close to the object in the arm and sort of watched this great football-shaped ball of light pulsate throughout the night. And they attested to me in an interview I did in 2015 that the object had an electrostatic interference with their police vehicle, preventing them from being able to transmit dispatches from them. And so they sort of watched this all happen over the course of the night, and eventually it just kind of went up and disappeared after several hours. But it was witnessed and documented by many students.
This is Hillsdale, and the girls at Hillsdale College had a night to remember.
Well, when I was looking out the window with binoculars, I guess it was about 12, I saw it, and I saw two red lights, and I saw what looked to be shaped like a pie. I could just see the front of it, and I just saw the round front, and I could see the lights on either side. And then the red light was sort of casting a glow over the whole thing, so it looked like a round disc.
At first, when I'd heard the other girls talk about it, I believed them, yet I couldn't really make myself comprehend it because I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But then when I saw it, I just was fascinated. I wasn't afraid. I just wanted to stay there and keep my eyes glued to it. I couldn't leave.
I know I saw it, but, and I know myself I saw it, but I believe I saw it, but I can't fathom it because it seems so unreal.
They called the guy by the name of Bud Van Horn, who occupied an office that no longer exists because the Cold War is no longer going. It was like the civil manager, or something like this.
William Van Horn, Hillsdale's undertaker and civil defense director, also spotted the UFO and was out with his Geiger counter next day, checking a mysterious perfect circle where the UFO had been seen. Van Horn did not find any radioactivity here, but this did not shake his certainty that he had seen a hovering vehicle with two lights. Many people asked him why he did not go right up to the UFO in the dark.
I'd much rather be a live coward than a dead hero. And with the area of uncertainty that we have here, how do I know but what maybe maybe there's a current, a little electrical charge which is being radiated by one of these vehicles, which would electrocute you if you got within a certain area of it. There was no sound whatsoever. I could not hear a bit of sound.
Over the next few days, news of the UFO sighting spread like wildfire. People flocked to Hillsdale to investigate evidence of the extraterrestrial for themselves. The Hillsdale College UFO Club was launched, offering UFO rides around Central Hall. Meanwhile, the phone at Bud Van Horn's office was ringing off the hook with calls from reporters and news agencies, begging for an inside scoop. Soon, news of the sighting hit the national stage.
CBS reports UFO, friend, foe, or fantasy. Reported by CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Reports of flying saucers are nothing new. From the beginning of recorded time, men have been seeing unexplainable things in the sky, and there's no reason to doubt they saw something. The question is, was what they saw really there? And what was it they really saw?
The sighting at Hillsdale drew significant attention, leading the U.S. Air Force to open an investigation. They needed to put a stop to rumors and get to the bottom of what had happened. They sent in Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astrophysicist and Project Blue Book consultant, for the job.
So, a guy named J. Allen Hynek, who was known for investigating this kind of thing for Project Blue Book, came to Hillsdale and interviewed people, assessed the site, and came to a conclusion which became sort of infamous, that it was caused by swamp gas, which is this sort of natural phenomenon that arises in areas in spring, often as they're sort of moving out of the winter thaw. There's a kind of decay of gas that occurs and can cause lights to appear.
The government is forced to send their UFO investigator, Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He did no science for UFOs. He never did an investigation. He was their debunker. He was, an astronomical consultant, scientific consultant. His job, and he admitted this later in writing in one of his books, his job was to disinterest the public in the whole UFO thing.
Famous Dutch astronomer Minnaert, in his book Light and Color in the Open Air, has this to say about swamps. He describes lights that have been seen in swamps by the astronomer Bessel and other excellent observers. The lights, he says, resembles tiny flames, sometimes seen right on the ground, sometimes floating above it. The flames go out in one place and suddenly appear in another, giving the illusion of motion. No heat is felt. The lights do not burn or char the ground. They can appear for hours, this is all a quotation, they appear for hours at a time and sometimes for a whole night. Generally there is no smell and usually no sound except the popping sound of little explosions, such as when a gas burner ignites. This is precisely what was observed there.
I did see the burn spots that were up the hill from the Arb. It was kind of like burned out grass and kind of oval shaped, not necessarily round. But I think there were 4 of them. I can't remember exactly, 3 or 4. Which made one believe that it was not swamp gas. And then when that report came out that it was swamp gas, the town was again in an uproar. But I'd say the majority didn't believe the report.
When he arrives, you have to remember this is 1966, and the small towns in southern Michigan were much different than they are now. They were lively. And when Hynek arrives in Dexter, there are people crowded all over, the swamp, and they're convinced it was aliens. That's what happened. And, as Hynek was starting to interview eyewitnesses, this guy steps out of his car, takes a fiddle out of his case, and starts playing it. And he says later, "I was hoping to call the phantom spirits down to earth." Another guy blinks a message in Morse code to the aliens, to show themselves. And so, Hynek, of course, after seeing this stuff, was understandably pretty skeptical.
I've had many letters pointing out that they, as children on the farm, had many experiences with swamp lights, and that this was obviously the thing that it was, and they couldn't understand why the people in Michigan got so excited over swamp lights. And the illusion of motion frequently is given by the fact that a little bit of swamp light appears here, it goes out, another one appears over here, that goes out then, but the illusion as viewed from a distance is that the objects have moved back and forth. And sometimes this gas will gather into a ball and actually float away.
Dr. Hynek does a press conference at the Detroit Press Club. There were over 60 representatives from the media from all over the country. And he told the world that it was swamp gas. It was the spontaneous combustion of rotting vegetation on the floor of a swamp. But he said it only applied to Dexter and Hillsdale, and he couldn't explain the other ones.
He really runs into problems, though, when he comes down to Hillsdale, because there you have a number of eyewitnesses who are all convinced that something occurred, and that's where he coins his famous term, swamp gas, just waving it all away. If you've been into the Ark, there's not much of a swamp there. And there wasn't then, and there isn't now.
That story of swamp gas went nationwide, went through the world, and it launched that part of our lexicon where we go, that's not a UFO, it's just swamp gas.
Not simply take every statement made and give it credence. You have to get the least common denominator of these statements. And when you do that, then I was able to get from them that the lights appeared to rise somewhat and descend, not many times, a few times during the course of the evening. Both the Hillsdale girls and the people at Dexter described the glow of the lights behind the trees as though they would get brighter and dimmer, as though stage lights were being turned up with a rheostat, as they do in stage lights. None of them, except those two people, Mr. Manor and his son, no one else described an object, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen.
Are you saying, Doctor, that Michigan is now producing non-existent saucers?
Well, it's one way of putting it, I suppose.
But those who had witnessed the event knew what they had seen, and they didn't believe the theory handed to them by government officials.
Van Horn, in sort of protest of this report, does his own soil report and finds things that are not normally in the soil, in the Ark, and holds this up as proof that, that something happened.
Here we have Bud Van Horn. He's the Civil Defense Director out in Hillsdale for Hillsdale County, and he has seen the UFOs. In fact, he watched one last night. I wonder, do you go along with the theory of Mr. Van Horn that it would be gas out there that caused this?
Definitely not, Bob. Very definitely not. I have received very poor reception and have been made to look like a very ignorant person.
I remember the town was interesting because it was half, nah, that couldn't have happened, disbelief, and the other half said, oh yeah. So that was kind of fun, but
And those who participated in the investigation were equally divided.
I'm not saying that there aren't things in the sky that we don't know about. What I am saying is that when there's anything that one doesn't know about, then the mind fills it with a great mass of fantasy.
I've slowly come to the conclusion that there are such things as interplanetary spaceships. I'll have to stick my neck out and say that because I believe it at long last.
It subsequently emerged that Hynek probably made this statement under some degree of pressure from the Air Force, under which Project Blue Book was housed. And even at the time, there was a degree of dissatisfaction with this as an explanation. And Hynek would later sort of confess that there was some duress involved with this as an explanation. And I say this is an infamous explanation because it sort of traveled very widely in the UFO investigatory world as a sort of jokey catch-all, like, oh, it must have been swamp gas.
Hynek lied, and you can look up his lies because they're available in the Blue Book records. You can see, if you go to the congressional record, which I have done and I've summarized in my book, The Secretary of the Air Force lied. Everyone and they didn't know they were being lied to.
I said here in this statement at the end that I emphasize in conclusion that I cannot prove in a court of law that marsh gas is the full explanation of these sightings. But it does appear to me extremely likely.
So there's just that things are put into this weird twilight zone, if you will, that more or less have been stuck in since, because there's never been any definitive proof offered that it was actually an extraterrestrial object, because I think that's just a hard thing to prove. No one's really proved that about anything. But if you just talk to the students, or you read the student accounts at the time, you're able to talk to anyone who witnessed it after the fact. It's just hard. They find it hard to reject the possibility that it was something that couldn't be explained, and that's just more or less where people have been since. And that's where they've stuck, and that's where the colleges have stuck, to the extent people still think about it.
You know, something that I'd like to talk with Major Kehoe about a little bit later, but I was intrigued by finding out that the Republican leader of the House, Senator Ford, has called Representative Ford, isn't it? Representative Senator Gerald Ford. I don't know him. Republican leader, House Republican leader, has to be representative, of course. Gerald Ford called for a full-blown investigation of unidentified flying object sightings. This is something that Major Kehoe has been talking about for quite a few years.
If you go up to the Gerald Ford archives in Ann Arbor, you can access, there are cubic feet of letters written from people in Hillsdale, Dexter, Ann Arbor, essentially every town in southern to southwestern Michigan, sort of demanding answers. I mean, people really wanted to know what happened here. And Gerald Ford, who was a prominent House Republican at the time, took up the cause and said, the people of Michigan want to know what happened. We need a congressional investigation of this sighting.
The demand for answers grew so great that future U.S. President Gerald Ford became involved. The Michigan representative called for an in-depth investigation of the sightings and their possible explanations. But his call for action was ignored, and as the government became increasingly engaged in the Cold War, UFO sightings in the small Michigan town were forgotten.
People were sort of freaked out about the idea that there could be something identified flying over American airspace. And so Ford called on either the Air Force, who had sent Hynek down in the first place, to be more transparent, or, barring that, for Congress to do an investigation. And this was met widely with derision in the Washington press corps. I remember one reporter referred to Michigan as the free martini before dinner state because of all of these sightings. And the congressman who represented Ann Arbor, where the first, in whose district the first sighting happened, he took the opposite tack. He would say he was one of these Great Society technocrats. And so his name's Wes Vivian. And so Vivian says, Congressman Ford, that's a really interesting idea that you have for Congress to investigate these so-called sightings. What if instead of that we passed it off to a research university? And that's what happened. I think I want to say that the University of Colorado eventually got all of Project Blue Book's papers, and that was kind of it. Ford never got his investigation, and we never really learned the secret or the truth of the sightings.
To this day, the people of Hillsdale have never received a clear answer as to what they saw on that mysterious night in March 1966.
The Hillsdale-Dexter story became so famous for a number of reasons. One, it gave us the phrase swamp gas. It's funny, it's sarcastic, as you can tell. It says it all. It also gives us a chance to come to grips with the fact that things are visiting us from off-planet. And it's not something that's easy for people to come to grips with. So I think using that phrase swamp gas, kind of, like whistling in the dark past a cemetery kind of thing. You had Hynek who was there. So you had all the key players, and you had great witnesses. Hundreds of co-eds. Who doesn't like a story with co-eds from Hillsdale, right? You had people who stuck to the guns. You had the police. You had firemen. You had politicians. Everybody, okay, so a few of them, you might question their statements. But anyway, you had great witnesses. So all of that together just makes it an enduring story.
Not inclined to believe the swamp gas explanation. I do not think that any of the witnesses were lying. I think that they rationally interpreted and reported things that they saw. I don't think that they were being misled by their sort of senses, their sense impressions. But I just don't know what exactly it is that they did see. I find it difficult to hazard a guess because the explanation that would be the funnest to give would just change the nature of reality as we know it. And I am not prepared to do that in this documentary, at least not without a little more evidence and research than what I've already done.
So I'm inclined to believe official explanations, but this one is that's absurd. There has to be a swamp for there to be swamp gas. What actually happened, I think it's anyone's guess. An old friend of mine likes to say that anything involving the extraterrestrial more likely involves the supernatural. I don't know if I'm ready to go there though, but who knows?
As far as I'm concerned, it's case closed. Flying saucers.
The rest of us can emulate the scientists by keeping an open mind, since yesterday's fantasy sometimes turns into tomorrow's reality. But we might remember, too, that while fantasy improves science fiction, science is more often served by facts. This is Walter Cronkite for CBS Reports. Good night.
So Claire, do you think that there were aliens in the Arb?
I don't have to think anything. I know that there were aliens in the Arb.
It's often said that the simplest explanation is usually the true explanation. In this case, the specialists literally served it to us on a silver platter. It obviously was not aliens. We know aliens don't exist. It was definitely a government cover-up.
At this point, it's not a matter of aliens. It's a matter of humans and what they said they saw that night. I don't know what was out there, but there has to be a rational explanation. We can agree that the swamp gas explanation was hokey at best, but there had to be something that makes this make sense.
It's 1966. The Cold War is in full swing. Obviously, the government space program was testing new technology, and something went awry. They got too close to civilization, i.e. Hillsdale College, and they had to cover it up. That's the simplest explanation, and it's the correct explanation.
If there weren't aliens in the Arb, what did the Air Force track? What did Bud Van Horn find different in the soil than what was consistent in the Arb? None of it really adds up unless it's something else. And you gotta be thinking about it at the same time that all of this is going on, right? This isn't Santa Claus. This isn't the Tooth Fairy, right? People have thought that aliens have been around for
years, you know? It would be odd, it would be out of place for us to be the anomaly, for us to be the only entity in the entire universe, the entire galaxy. Why would it just be us? And why would no one ever make contact? It would make sense for something to have visited. Would it make sense for something to visit Hillsdale College? I don't know, maybe, but it wasn't just here. It was also in Dexter. It was all over Michigan. It was kind of all over everywhere at this point in time. This is really when the UFO craze started, and I think there's something to that.
The government was even scrambling to keep up with the Dexter sightings that happened the night before the aliens were spotted in the ARB.
The US government is obviously testing new technology for the space program. Hillsdale, Michigan, the perfect place.
They saw something. Something was there, but I don't think it was aliens.
I ask you to read the accounts of Gidget Cone from what she saw that night and not believe that there was something extraterrestrial up in the sky that night.
At the end of the day, it's not really a matter of who's gonna go out there and who's gonna start looking, because it happened decades ago. There's not really all that much that we can uncover now, looking at it with modern scientific eyes. And at the end of the day, I don't really think any of us should try to, because at least all of us working on the documentary would rather be live cowards than we would dead heroes.